Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's first thing Thursday morning, but hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, so let's jump in and see what we got. First up, on Floatplane, Schurzger has a GBS control that they're looking to connect to a consumer-grade CRT with an RGB SCART input, and they were able to make a custom cable that includes a sync combiner circuit, the one that Steve from HD Retrovision put up that I posted on RetroRGB a while back, in order to convert the sync to what you would find. See, the GBS control could output multiple different resolutions, and it could even do 480i and 240p, which is presumably what Schurzger is using this for as a downscaling box, because consumer-grade CRTs almost always can only do 15 kilohertz, 240p and 480i. However, the GBS control, regardless of resolution, will output that as RGB HV. So Schurzger built a custom cable with that sync combiner circuit, and that works, except when you connect it directly to the CRT, there's still an issue with the blanking voltages. Now, many consumer-grade PAL CRTs with the SCART input rely on specific voltages being sent to tell it whether to be in 16 by 9 or 4 by 3 mode, or whether it's going to be in RGB or composite mode. A lot of CRTs have a manual way to do this in the menus. Some of them have a switch. However, they all could rely on this voltage. So when Schurzger plugs that cable into a G-SCART switch and then plugs it from the G-SCART into the TV, everything seems to work. However, when the cable's plugged in directly, a bunch of weird stuff happens, making him think the voltage isn't correct, even though it probably is. So what would I recommend trying next? Well, since you've already gone through the trouble of doing all of this, what I would just do is stick a multimeter, any cheap multimeter, into the output pins of the G-SCART switch and see the exact voltages you're getting on the two blanking signals, and try to make sure that what you're sending through your cable matches those voltages. And if there's a discrepancy, even if the voltages that you have are still within SCART tolerances, so let's just say, I'm making these numbers up, by the way, this is just a total speculation. Let's say that you have it at 3 volts, which is under spec, and the G-SCART switch has it at 5 volts, and it works and yours doesn't. Just set it to 5 volts. Don't go over 12, and in fact, that's kind of even pushing it anyway, but I think you should be fine. Give that a try, see what happens. Just test with a multimeter. And if it still doesn't work, you could try buying pre-existing solutions. Schurzger mentioned that Retro Upgrades has a VGA to SCART adapter with the blanking signal. Also, Consoles for You has that adapter that you just add USB power to do that. So I would start, since you've already gone through all this trouble, just double checking the voltages, seeing if you get them to match up, and go from there. And if that doesn't work, then spend some money on an external solution. I don't know which is the one that you're referring to from Retro Upgrades, but I'll leave you to the one that Jan from Consoles for You made. But yeah, it's a common issue, and hopefully we'll be able to find the exact solution. Now, moving over to Patreon, mostly harmless, just wanted to show some love and say some nice things. And I just wanted to say thank you, and also say that I always read it when people put nice things in their comments and their questions, but I don't say them out loud, just in interest of everybody's time. I know I talk too much as it is, so I just don't want to sit there and include all of that stuff. But as I'm reading these Q&As, I always read them, and I always really, really appreciate them. And anybody that's ever been to expos or hung out at places like Arcade Brooklyn knows that most people in the scene are really just awesome. They're just like-minded nerds that want to hang out and have fun. Just, the internet is the internet. So sometimes, even though I know that to be true, it's kind of hard weeding through just ankle-deep crap all day long, getting pummeled on social media. And it's like, sometimes it's just nice to have, to read nice comments. So thank you to everybody who takes the time to do it. By all means, you don't have to. Just ask your question and I'll happily answer it either way. But I just wanted to let everybody know. Thank you. I really do read all of those things, and they do mean a lot. You don't ever have to put them in, but that's why I just never repeat them out loud in each question, just to save everybody time. But thank you all very much. Next up, Apothecary2 said, about Pro Logic Dolby Surround. They've been finding it annoying trying to confirm the games and console are set up correctly, since you need to be in what's also a surround sound upmixing mode on the AVR or soundbar to hear it. Most games don't even have an explicit surround option, and even fewer have an actual sound test the way Ace Combat Zero or Rogue Leader does. Sometimes they're not sure if a game does actually have Pro Logic or not if it's not listed somewhere on the game itself. Like there are N64 games on Switch Online, they heard the Switch actually has to be set to stereo for it to work, which kind of makes sense, but honestly they still sound similar with the Switch set to surround. So a couple of things on this. First, I understand the frustration, and we'll get to that in a second. But for anybody listening, if you do watch that video I did on Dolby Surround on modern receivers, you could just skip to the end to get to those sound tests, and that's how you could test your stereo to see if it's compatible. So basically, write down whatever you need to do. For me, it's just I put it in Dolby Surround mode, and it automatically decodes it. But that's all you would really need to do in order to take advantage of this. You could look on the box, on the disc itself, or the cartridges. Most of the time, it advertises Dolby Surround or Pro Logic or anything like that. And in fact, I think that might actually be part of the licensing, is they have to have, if they're paying to use Dolby Audio, they're also paying to get the logo. So I would just start from there and see where you go. Now, in the scenario of you're not sure if the game has it, or you're not sure which mode to use, or maybe it has it, but you set your stereo to just 2-speaker mode. Maybe you have something like mine with analog bypass that for older consoles sounds really good that way. That's a subjective comment, but just still, in my opinion. So maybe you're in that scenario where you only want to switch it to surround sound mode if you know for sure that the Pro Logic elements are working and they're worth using. And that's where things get confusing, because then you would have to choose between analog pass-through 2-channel and surround mode. And if you're not actually getting Pro Logic, you're using a simulated surround mode, which is fine, but that might not be the best choice. So for nerds like us that are always looking to get the best experience, that presents the problem. How do you know? So I just would start by doing what I just said, and that's double check that your stereo, and Apothecary too. This is more of a general answer than one directly to your scenario, because you sound like you already know exactly what to do. But my general answer to everybody in this scenario would just be, make sure you're 100% sure that your receiver is compatible with Pro Logic, because many of the modern ones are not, and make sure you know exactly what mode it needs to be set to. And that way you could kind of just test for yourself. And with stuff like this, you could argue that whatever your ears prefer is right, because they're both official audio tracks. They both work and probably sound fine. So I think that's basically it. Now, for the Switch part, that's something that I'm actually questioning, because if you have something like a retro game being played through an emulator, if they're using the original sound channels, then that Pro Logic would be encoded inside those stereo signals, and it would be up to the decoder to read those. So I don't understand why setting your Switch between stereo and surround mode would make a difference. The only thing that I'm just speculating here, but it could be that when it sets it to surround mode, it is outputting 5 channels. And since it's only receiving 2 channels from the emulator, it's only sending it to the 2 speakers. Thereby, if you set it to stereo mode, it's setting a stereo signal, allowing your receiver to do the decoding. But can anybody confirm that? Absolutely sure, because I think that's important info to know for anybody using retro games through the Switch, through their Switch Online service and all of that stuff. You're going to find it more with N64, because, Star Fox and maybe one other had it on the Super Nintendo, but we'll see. But so that's kind of my thoughts on it. I'll leave a link to the Dolby Surround video I did for anybody who's interested. And if you've already seen it, just skip to the end to get to the sound test for it. But so that's basically everything. But let me know if I missed something. Next up, Space Farmer was just wondering how long analog video cable runs can be before signal quality degrades, assuming you're using high-quality shielded cables, and how much high-quality switchers like Extron crosspoints and G-SCART switches and SVSs and all the good switches extend those runs. They usually just connect their consoles to their crosspoint and their crosspoint to their scaler and CRTs directly, but they were thinking about adding loopbacks so that you could have the RetroTink RGB to comp and comp to RGB transcoders linked in so that you could route whatever you wanted. So if it's a component video input, you could still get an RGB output, and that way all CRTs would be compatible regardless of the input signal. So would a run like that degrade signal quality in a perceivable way? So excellent questions, and I have a couple of different answers because I want to make sure I answer this not just for you, but for everybody listening. First and foremost, you nailed the most important part here. You said, assuming you're using high quality shielded cables. Because if you're using poor cables, it's like 3 inches before you start to seriously see quality drop. It's that short before the signal starts to degrade it. I think you could get away with like short adapters, as long as they're not run too terribly, that are not fully shielded, and that's fine. But so you nailed it. You need quality shielded cables in order to make sure this is possible at all. And the other thing that you said is, would a run like that degrade the signal in a perceivable way? So in the context of playing video games, a perceivable way would be, adding interference, adding diagonal lines, dimming the picture in a way that you can't just easily compensate. All of the things that would certainly make it, you would notice just by turning it on and playing. And the answer to that is, if done right, no. I'll get into more detail in a second. However, like always, if you're somebody who's doing video signal analysis, if you're doing comparisons of two versions of a game, you want the cleanest possible capture. And that's what I always talk about, how almost nobody needs lossless capture. But if you do, it's required to do your job right if you're going to be doing these comparisons. So in a perceivable way for gaming, if done right, no. Now, what's the actual length? I think that's going to depend. And I guess another general fact to just keep in your head is, anytime you have analog signals, audio or video, every single device you put in between has the possibility to degrade the signal a little bit. And the longer the runs, the more that's a possibility. But what you're talking about, I've done. I did it here. I had it running for a couple of months, even the loopback thing that you were talking about. And I did not see any perceivable quality when playing. And I was kind of looking for it too, because I was kind of wondering the same thing. So in a situation like that, I would just say keep the cable lengths as short as possible within reason. I did run into a scenario in which I got a 2 foot or a 1 foot fully shielded component video cable, and I was just trying to loop it around so I could have everything right on top of each other. And it ended up being more work than just using a longer cable, because I had to affix everything to itself. I had to zip tie the cables down because there was a lot of tension on the lines because it was such a short run. So adding another foot or two to that cable might have actually made things easier and less chance of visible difference, because if your cables are slowly backing themselves out, you might get some video flicker or something happening on screen. So an extra foot of cable theoretically might drop the signal a tiny bit, but not as much as your cable backing itself out. So keep weird scenarios like that in mind, and just kind of and imagine every single thing be a potential source of problems. So if you're linking two HD RetroVision cables together, you have just the standard RCA to RCA, and then maybe you have the extension cable version. Consider doing something ridiculous like taking painter's tape, and after you've plugged in each one, wrap a little bit of painter's tape around it. Painter's tape specifically because it'll work fine, but when you take it off, it won't leave a lot of sticky goop on it. And if it does, you just wipe it off with a Clorox wipe or something like that. And, that just one extra step to prevent it from backing out. And, don't run stacks of cables on top of each other without making sure they're run in a way where you're not like tying cables around. They're running one on top and not looped around or something like that. Just basics, things that you would probably look at and immediately go, yeah, something doesn't look right with that one. So, to answer your question, I don't know what the exact foot length would be. I don't know if there is one, because I think when you start to talk about stuff like this, every component in your setup, the power in your house, I've been running into that issue recently. A lot of things could affect it. So keep the cables as short as possible within reason, like the silly example I just used, and just give it a try. And I think you'll be totally fine in that scenario. And I think with quality switches, you don't really have to worry about stuff like that. So all the, Crosspoint, SVS, G-SCART, G-Comp, all of those, the GamesCare ones, there's a couple other really good ones out there. And also powered switches versus manual push button switches. A manual push button switch is essentially the same as taking two cables and just unplugging and plugging them back in. So you're not having any video buffering whatsoever. So, if you added 3 of those together, you're going to get way more signal degradation than you would 3 G-SCARTs or something like that. So hopefully I was able to put that into perspective, but if you have any more specific questions, please let me know. I think I'll just point you in the right direction for now. Next up, bdaves88 says they use a Mister with the RetroTink 4K and an OLED, and it's awesome, but they've always wanted a CRT as well. They know they could pick up an old consumer CRT for cheap or free, but they're not afraid to invest in something nice that will work well for a long time. They just don't know how to go about it or what to expect. What they're looking for is a solid CRT or PVM to use primarily with a Mister. Their main goal is for it to function well and work for a long time, so it would be great if it were restored, calibrated, etc. by an expert. They don't need the fanciest BVM or anything like that, and they probably want around 19 inches, and they live in the Chicago area if that's relevant. Their questions are, where would I go to get a solid restored CRT or PVM? What kind of CRT or PVM would I recommend, and how much would something like that cost from a trusted source, and how long would it last? So I would go to Steve from RetroTech. I think you'd have to sign up for his Patreon, but if you're willing to invest in something kind of fancier, that's a minimal thing to consider. Um, there are other people out there that I absolutely would trust, but there's also a ton of scalpers, a ton of scammers, and also just a lot of people who mean well, but they don't really understand what it is that they have or they've done to it. And I'm being as respectful as possible, but if you're about to drop a lot of money, now's the time to make comments like that to you. So I don't mean to be mean about that, but there are just a lot of people that accidentally sell junk. So going through trusted sources is always important. However, I would approach this slightly different. I would go and find whatever free CRT that you could find and just start with that. And even if it's only got a composite video input, that's totally fine. Just grab a couple of, and this is the time to grab a couple of cheap AliExpress composite video cables for whatever consoles you're using just to see. If you're only going to be using it with a Mister, you could use one of those Mister adapters to get composite video out of it, which are not very expensive. And then you could just get a cheap composite cable, which should be totally fine, and see what that means to you. And it could very well be that you've gotten this thing that works great, but you're just going back to your amazing OLED TV and Tink 4K. Or it could be that you have, now it's like ignited something where you're like, okay, I get it now. This is why people want these things. And then you would just have to decide what the detail level that you want on screen is and what the size is. So for me personally, I have found that, and this is my opinion today, it changes every couple of years, but I have found that while a 20-inch PVM that's in good condition absolutely looks better than a 27-inch consumer grade TV that's been RGB modded. I mean, it definitely looks better. There's more lines on screen, there's more detail, the colors pop a bit more. I'd still prefer the 27-inch. I think that's the perfect size for CRT gaming for my eyes on my couch in my room. Everybody's different. I know so many people whose favorite size is 14-inch, and that's awesome. Maybe it's what they had as a kid, maybe where they have it sitting in front of them, it's the perfect size. But that's the type of thing you need to figure out, because if you're like, oh no, I want a giant one, a giant calibrated PVM in good condition is going to cost a ton of money. So you might as well just get a really nice tube consumer grade CRT and have that restored and RGB modded. Which brings me to the last parts of this. How long do I think it would last? So the tube itself and the main components that can't be replaced are the issue. So the tube, the flyback, and some of the proprietary boards that can't really be repaired. And that's always a roll of the dice. You could get something that looks like the tube is perfect. You could put it on a CRT scanner and it could say it's fine, but it's 20, 30, 40 years old. So maybe it'll die tomorrow. And that's what you definitely have to keep in mind. Even somebody who is an absolute expert, who spends all their time restoring these things, while I really hate this analogy, I think it's a perfect one here to say nobody has a crystal ball, so you don't really know what's going to happen with super old electronics. That said, if something's been properly restored, the capacitors have been replaced, and everything passes all of the tests, including just a physical inspection, looking at the flyback, everything looks fine, everything's in place. I mean, there's no telling how long it could last. 20 more years, 30 more years, more. I mean, who knows, right? There's still TVs working from the 60s. So it really just comes down to environmental factors and a lot of luck, I guess, as well. And how much would it cost? And that's the thing that drives people insane, because you have to understand that it takes hours and hours and hours to do this stuff. An RGB mod and a recap on a consumer grade CRT is like a weekend. So you're going to be spending way more on the work than you are on the monitor itself, especially with a consumer grade CRT. You could find yourself a mint condition one. You could find yourself a new old stock that's been sitting in somebody's basement for 30 years, and you're still going to want to have it restored because those capacitors have been sitting in a basement for 30 years. And that's the stuff that really I guess where you really get into cost is the rarer of the monitors, like BVMs and stuff like that, and also how many hours and how much money was already put into them. So in the case of something like you have a BVM D24 that's been recapped and calibrated and it comes in a flight case or something, and it's got a couple thousand hours max on it, you're looking at least $5,000 because of all of those things you're getting. You're getting a super rare monitor that has had tons of hours of work put into it and a bunch of money put into it. And, it's already a rare one, but it's got low hours and the counter to prove it. And it comes in a beautiful flight case so that you could store it or transport it. You're going to spend a ton of money. Whereas maybe you could also just find a curved screen 27-inch or 20-inch consumer CRT that the tube appears to be in good condition, and you spend $500 or $600 having somebody fully refurbish it. So, or it could be cheaper than that depending on what needs to be done. But I think you just anybody who wants to do this has to keep all of that context in mind. It's just not as easy as, oh yeah, this is what they go for. Everything is a factor in them too. So yeah, that's kind of my overall thoughts on all of that, but ask more questions if you'd like, and hopefully that's kind of some clarity on what to expect. Next up, Pippin wants to continue the conversation about capture card issues, this time focusing in on audio and signal drops. So the Elgato 4K 60 Pro tends to stop hearing the audio when they switch to another input on the RetroTink 4K, and sometimes it results in them having to restart the Tink or reset the signal. And they can't tell if it's the Elgato doing it or the RetroTink 4K, as when they had a regular Elgato, the Legacy Game Capture HD, it didn't do it. So I have seen what you're talking about, but there's a couple of things involved. First of all, while I haven't tested nearly as many capture cards as Epos Vox, I have tested a lot, and the Elgatos never work the same way twice for me. They have always been an issue, and that's the main reason why I don't use them or really recommend them, even though I know many people who have Elgatos that work flawlessly in their setup. But stuff like this is just something that I personally have always run into. Also, I do see the same problem on the AverMedia Live Gamer 4K, and I see it sometimes even when just switching between cameras. So sometimes on live streams, I'll use this camera when I'm standing here, or I'll have another camera over on my workbench area, and it's very often much easier for me to, instead of trying to wire up a bunch of switches, to just unplug the HDMI cable out of one and plug it into the other. But when I do that, occasionally the signal doesn't come back up. I just get a no signal issue. Anybody who watched the last stream may have seen that. And that was the same thing happened on that stream going between the Tink and the camera. But that's an issue with the Live Gamer 4K, and switching to a different device and then back almost always fixes it. Disabling it and re-enabling it in the device manager will fix it. And it doesn't bother me as much because of how rock solid that card is in other ways. But overall, it seems to be a common issue when you're switching sources or when you have signal drops in capture cards. So if the solution for you is just rebooting the RetroTink 4K, I would call that good enough, because even if you're in the middle of a live stream, it's not going to kill your stream. You just got to reboot the Tink, reload your profile, you're done. Maybe even do something like set the default profile to being the one that you're using on your stream before each stream, so all you have to do is reboot it and you don't even have to fumble with the remote. So that's certainly something to consider just for peace of mind. You could try a different capture card. There's a couple new ones out that I'm actually just waiting for Epos Vox to post reviews. Or maybe I missed them because got busy or something. Thanks for the reminder. I'm gonna go look up his channel after this. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my advice on this stuff, because when you get into capture issues, it's never ending. I mean, you could fight capture issues for the rest of your life, and a lot of my friends who are pro gamers and pro streamers do fight that daily. And even the most robust setup is going to have issues like that occasionally, especially with retro, because we're sending so many weird different signals. Even if you do something like normalize it through the RetroTinks triple buffer mode, it's still dropping signals every time you switch inputs and stuff like that. So that will kind of cause most capture cards to freak out a bit. So I don't know. I guess I would kind of step back and just see, is there an easy way to fix your workflow now? Or would you have to integrate some other kind of hardware into it? But kind of see what you think. Let me know, and we could keep working on this if you'd like. Next up, William Gunther's posting their first ever question. They have an innate worry about electrical hazards or risks from aging power supplies, especially those for Japanese retro consoles and the slight power differences between Japan and the US. So whenever they purchase a retro console, they almost always accompany it with a new modern power supply. Is this truly necessary, or are they worrying too much? So my strong opinion on this is that's exactly what I do, and for all the reasons that you probably already know. So while all power equipment is built with some tolerances built in, maybe that Japanese to US power is just enough to push it too hard or not enough or something. And yeah, aging power supplies, even name brand quality ones, the original SNES power supply, I've seen a bunch of those die, and they're actually really hard to take apart. The Genesis ones, you just need a screwdriver basically, and sometimes I use like a paint scraper to help pry that open a little bit, but you could replace the caps in those. It's much harder to do in the SNES, so picking up a Triad power supply just solves those problems. And it's also, you could feel free to make fun of me for wasting, but it's my opinion that if you've just bought, you've imported a console from Japan, it's something that's special to you, it's something you're going to use. What if you didn't need that power supply? So you lost $20 and you have something that's definitely going to be better over the next long-term period of time. It's not really a loss in my opinion. It's something that I just think is good as long as you're buying the right PSU. I'll leave a link to the ones that I always use, the Triad ones. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that you might not need. But if you think about it from the opposite, what if you do actually need it, but you didn't spend the $20-25 and now you've killed your console? You really would have rather spent that $20. So I have no problem recommending that, but being honest about maybe you don't need it, but I still think that you should probably do it. So good call on that. More specifically, they just purchased a Satelleavia for their Super Famicom and would love to have a modern power supply, but all the limited info on positive, negative center polarity, watts and volts, barrel size makes their head spin. Can someone point them to the right direction for an adapter that will turn their Satelleavia from a paperweight into a light-up paperweight? Doesn't it just use the same exact power supply as a Super Nintendo? So you could just buy two of the Triads for Super Nintendo. I've seen Satelleavias in person, but I've never owned one, and I never asked to look at the power supply, although I probably should have just for fun. So I'm going to have to have the chat answer this. What power supply does it use, and could it just use another SNES one? Next up, Jason Guffey wanted to continue the conversation from last week about Judder versus Stutter. And their Samsung S90D, awesome TV by the way, has motion handling options described as Judder reduction, which they believe is specifically for 24p film content. So yeah, it's not just film content. Almost everything that you see on streaming video services is 24p. And having that would basically mean that it's going to have an even cadence, or at least it should mean that. I've definitely seen TVs act weird, but it should mean that anything that has a 24p source is not going to have 3/2 pull down applied. It will just be done in an even cadence, which I think looks better. Also looks weird at first. If you're used to just watching only 24p via 3/2 pull down, the first couple times you watch it, you're going to go, something feels weird about this, but I do absolutely prefer it now. Those settings, according to Jason, are under the Game Motion Plus menu, which doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So maybe they're labeling it differently. I don't own a modern Samsung TV. I like them, but I definitely prefer the LGs over the Samsungs. I haven't owned a brand new Sony TV in a while. I'm looking forward to trying that at some point between now and never. But yeah, so I don't really know what to add with that one, but I can't imagine it would be worried about doing anything gaming specific if it's talking about 24p Judder. So does anybody know anything about Samsung TVs that they might want to chime in on that? Now, moving on, as for stutter, Jason said they guess stutter is specifically an irregular delay in frame cadence from input source to output display, and that is more often than not a game performance thing. Problem is, they've seen people use the terms interchangeably, and even some of the tooltips in their TV menus describe things like help reduce stuttering or jittery video. Stutter and jitter, I guess, maybe, but this is one of those nomenclature things where it's kind of like flat screen TV. How many people, including myself, improperly said flat screen TV when I should have been saying flat panel TV? Because CRTs do not have panels, but there are some CRTs that have flat screens on them. So I think this is just one of those things that you need to worry about picking and choosing your words correctly, and it's going to get very confusing, and you're going to have to just kind of read up on each scenario. But continuing, they thought stuttering was something specific to game performance, but they guess it's called that for any device outputting irregular, uneven frame rates for any reason. So their takeaway is that Judder is a byproduct of compensating for frame rates, like 24p on a 60 hertz screen, and stutter is a catch-all for any breakup of frame cadence. They guess we could call a scratch on a DVD that causes issues in playbacks to be stuttering as well. I think you've got it, but it is also confusing, and I would love to hear anybody else's opinion on it. And if I'm, accidentally getting this wrong, please correct me. But I think you're on the right track with this stuff. And for me personally, when I always hear Judder, the only thing to me that means in the context of TVs is 24 to 60. And as opposed to 24 to 120 or any other even cadence of that. So yeah, I think it's pretty interesting as well. And everybody correct us if we're wrong, but I think you're on the right track. Next up, Rob has a Virtual Boy with the Virtual Tap VGA output installed. If they plug it into the HD15 port of their RetroTink 4K, it plays perfectly, but they're wanting to see if it would be possible to connect the systems into their G-Comp switches. From what they've read, the Virtual Tap is putting out RGB HV 31 kHz, and the G-Comp switch is expecting RGB 15 kHz. Is that correct? Sort of, but also no. So the first thing you need to do is press the stat button on your RetroTink 4K remote when when the Virtual Tap is outputting to it, or you could manually do that through the menu. And you want to read what the input resolution is, because the Virtual Tap can output either 320 by 240 via 15 kilohertz or a true VGA resolution. I think it's 800 by 600, but you're going to want to double check that, because just because it's got the VGA connector doesn't necessarily mean it's a VGA signal. VGA connectors, they're really just HD15 connectors. You could use them for anything. So you need to confirm that to double check a bunch of different things, but let's just keep going. So they mentioned that they were tried to get a few VGA to SCART converters, and when they connect it to their PVM, you get you get interference on screen. You don't get a true signal. So if this is something like the VGA version with 800 by 600, you're never going to be able to use that on your PVM without downscaling that signal first. And I'm not sure if the GBS control can downscale 800 by 600. And at that point, if your goal was to play on the PVM, you might want to switch the firmware on the Virtual Tap or switch it over. You might have to do a reinstallation, in fact, to get it to output RGB instead. But you'd have to look into that. I haven't really messed with that before. The Virtual Boy that I previously owned had two Virtual Taps, one in each eye, one that outputted RGB and one that outputted VGA, which is insane, but I wanted it because I used both for different applications. But just to continue on, because it'd be very easy for me to get off topic here, they also think they might need to combine the sync before it goes into any converters or anything like that. So if you're using a VGA to SCART converter, it almost surely has some kind of sync combining circuit built in, whether it's a passive XNOR circuit like the one Steve from HD Retrovision posted for us a long time ago, or whether it's an active one, doesn't really matter. However, what you do need to worry about, regardless of what the signal output is the compatibility. So if you're going through G-Comps, you should be able to use a VGA cable that breaks out the signals to, the RGB colors and then H and V, and you could potentially try to route those through the G-Comp, but I don't think that would work because you would have to use either a way to combine the sync and put that through the composite video port, or you would have to try to run it over audio, but I think the audio filtering would prevent that from working at all. So I don't know. As far as a G-SCART switch, that could technically work. And I think the resolutions, the refresh rate frequency should be fine for that. But the sync combiner could mess with the signal. And since the virtual tap is a very odd signal, which it's not a problem with the virtual tap, it's just the Virtual Boy outputs a really odd signal, you find compatibility issues with it. So one example is you can't use it through the RetroTink 5X through the SCART port without some kind of special sync combiners in there because of this exact thing. So it really might just be easiest for you to leave it plugged directly into your RetroTink 4K. And if you want it on your PVM, kind of look into downscaling solutions to see if that could work, or have another one installed for RGB output. Another quick question, they know I can combine G-Comp and G-SCART switches into the same setup, but can you do multiples, like 2 G-Comps and a single G-SCART, and use the sources interchangeably? Yeah, you absolutely could, except just remember that if you're going from one to the other, you're probably going to need some kind of transcoder. And if you do it that way, the transcoder needs to be switched. You need to buy like a USB cable with a power switch, because if it's always on, the switch is always going to think that port is active. So if you went from like your G-Comp into another G-Comp into a G-SCART, you would need to convert that signal, so it wouldn't be fully automated. And if you're doing stuff like that, you might really want to look into Artemis's SVS or even an Extron Crosspoint if you need matrix switching. So, for example, could you use inputs of consoles on SCART or component and still go to the same connected outputs? Totally, yes. But what would be easier is if you had 2 inputs on your device, or so that way you don't have to worry about any kind of switching or signals. So let's just say in the case of your RetroTink 4K, you have one G-Comp into the other G-Comp into the component video inputs, and then the G-SCART into the SCART input, and that would work the best in that scenario. Once again, having multiple inputs and multiple outputs, you'd be best with the SVS, because that way you could just send everything through the VGA output to the RetroTink's VGA input and just switch it from there. Also on outputs, can any output source be used for outputting? They would love it if they outputted to the RetroTink 4K on a G-Comp switch while also outputting from the G-SCART to their PVM. Yes, but just basic common sense, right? So if you have G-Comp 1 going to G-Comp 2 going to your RetroTink, and you want to use one of those outputs to go to a PVM, then if it's in G-Comp 1, if you use that second output, you would only be able to have the consoles that are behind it. Whereas if you use the second output from G-Comp 2, you'd be able to have all of the ones that are behind it. So yes, that would totally work. You just have to remember which consoles are behind which switch. And one thing that a lot of people do in a multi-switch setup is move everything based on signal types. So generally speaking, RGB SCART is only going to be 15 kilohertz. And yeah, I know there's a million other scenarios, but generally speaking, that's what it's going to be. So they would put all of their stuff that's only 240p or 480i and no chance of 480p, that gets routed through the G-SCART, and one output to your 15 kilohertz only PVM, the other one to the SCART input of your RetroTink 4K. And then everything that has the potential for 480p, but also supports others, would be component video output. And then that way you could run them that way. So you're totally separate and you don't have to worry about each of them. But both of the things that you asked about, the Virtual Boy output and the linking of different switches, get a little more complicated than that. So I think I was able to build the groundwork for you, but please ask any other questions if you want me to clarify on any of this stuff. Next up, Brian Carbone said, on the last Q&A, I mentioned having 5 separate retro carts. Creating their own based off of mine and Tito's recommendations was a game changer for them and let them fully appreciate retro gaming on a CRT. Glad to hear that. They're curious if I could share what I have on each cart or how I think about the use cases of each one. They imagine I move stuff around a lot for testing, but they're curious nonetheless. Yeah, so I'm going to move my mic sideways here and kind of just talk about it while I'm looking at it. I will do a video at some point that actually goes through and shows you all of this, but it's not even close to done yet. So the purpose of me doing all this, just to start, was so that I could have access to each of these displays wherever I needed them. Over here for streaming, in front of my couch for when I actually just want to sit and play, which is rare these days. So the versatility of it was why. However, I started to see the bonus of having each. So I have a widescreen HD CRT with a Wii, and I wish I could also have like a PS3, an Xbox, and maybe even an Xbox 360 connected to it. But at the moment, it's really just Wii, and that I think is the perfect setup for those consoles because you have access to a lot of games that are true widescreen games. Especially on the Wii, of course, because while they will output 4:3, you're putting that in a letterboxed window with the black bars on the top and the bottom. Then I have an NEC XM29 that has a PlayStation 2, a Dreamcast, a PS3. Also have a Wii on it just because I had a second Wii, but I normally just play it on the widescreen. And I also have a consoleized MVS Neo Geo just because Neo Geos feel right on shadow mask displays like that, because it's the same style that was in the arcade. I have a Sony PVM with a mister connected to it and nothing else, which I use for a lot of testing. But generally speaking, I pull that one out when I just want the PVM experience. And then I have a 27-inch consumer-grade Sony Trinitron that is RGB modded. It's in the midst of, it got damaged in transit. And that has all of my, and that one's going to be kind of interesting because the NES and the Master System that are on there, I specifically want access to both composite video and RGB modes. The NES is actually completely stock, so that one would be composite only. The Master System, I want both because the 3D games I truly think look better in composite because it hides how not great some of those games are, the look of them. And, in context, they were awesome for the 80s, but you're going to try to get them to hold up today. You need to use some tricks like using composite. I also have a Super Nintendo and a Genesis, and then a Mister as well. But the way that's wired is the SCART input, when the switch is off, it just goes back to being a composite video input. So when I use sync on composite video cables, I now have access to both on all the consoles that support both, or just composite on the NES. So each of them have a very specific use case, and I'm super lucky that I still got to keep a bunch of really cool CRTs. But I would love to do another follow-up, retro kart video someday on that stuff, because I do think that if people have the space, saving a ton of money, you would save a ton of money buying 2 CRTs than going into finding a multi-format like I talked about last week. But also, depending on what content you're looking to display, having a widescreen HD CRT might actually be better for your content than a single 4:3 multi-format monitor. So I'll go into that at some point, but there's a long backlog of stuff I got to work on, and I'm also still got to deal with the dailies that I love writing up on RetroRGB. So I'm going to try my best to get to those, but time is the thing I have the least of, and I'm just trying to get everything done, which is the other reason I really love doing these Q&As, because I get to have these conversations without spending 40 to 100 hours doing a video on it. So good question, Brian, and hopefully I was able to add some perspective. But I think, I think where I'm getting at with this is a pretty solid setup for retro gamers. Well, that's it for this week. Hopefully the audio was okay. As you probably heard, as the weather's getting nicer, I want to just enjoy with the windows open, but there's dogs barking, it's work going on in the neighborhood, people mowing their lawns. So I'll switch over to AC soon, and that's really easy to filter out, but I just kind of want to enjoy the weather for a little longer. But anyway, anybody who has any questions at all, please just ask wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post, because the way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post, but I also just like scrolling through in real time and answering as if we were hanging out together somewhere, just like you saw today. So any questions you have, just post them in the latest Q&A post wherever you support. If I don't get to them, it's only because the question popped up after I was done recording, but before I got the video uploaded. So just DM me or re-ask if you want to. So as always, thank you to everybody who participates, and especially anybody who supports in any way whatsoever, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.